Hello, this is a video tutorial outlining how to use the QThing computer utility to program the different functions and settings of the QThing. You do not have to use this utility to operate the QThing, as in its default mode with no programming you can still activate up to 16 audio tracks via the QThing's buttons or via the QThing switching sockets, and you can also play up to 14 tracks all at the same time, as the QThing supports polyphonic 16-bit stereo capability. However, the computer utility gives you many useful options for different ways of starting, stopping, pausing and grouping audio files together and controlling them in very creative ways. The utility is used to automatically generate an init file that is then used to program the QThing's different functions. The init file is exported from the utility and copied onto the QThing's micro SD card, and this init file then tells the QThing how to respond to different button presses. Initially, the utility looks quite complicated, but with experimentation and a little practice it will quickly become easy to use, and indeed about half of the different options within the utility are not supported by this version of the QThing, as they are for MIDI use only. So, to make it clearer, I will briefly open another window that has all of the non-supported and irrelevant MIDI features removed, so that you can see exactly which aspects of the utility are relevant to the QThing's programming. So firstly, here at the bottom, you can see the different options for opening an existing init file in order to edit it, saving an init file, and making a new init file. There is also a stop all button, which will stop all of the currently playing audio files, a quit button that will exit the utility, and a help button that will take you to a web page where you may find further useful information. Here you can see the output volume, which controls the combined output of all of the audio tracks, and below it you can see the low power option. This can be used to put the QThing into a sleep mode to save battery power when the QThing has been inactive for between 15 seconds and 1 hour. At the top here is the heart of the utility, and it is where all of the controlling functions and options are selected for the QThing, and it will cover these different options and functions in more detail in a moment. Below we have the buttons for generating, editing and testing the individual init files, and below them is the box where the init files are written to and eventually exported from using the Save As button I mentioned earlier. So now I'll bring back the full utility window and look at all of the functions in more detail. The first thing to say is that if you are using the optional fast test cable and socket to connect your QThing to your computer, then you will be able to test the init files as you write them with your QThing. If you are not using a fast test cable, then you will need to save the init files onto your micro SD card and then insert the SD card into the QThing in order to test them. So, in the system box, you do not need to adjust the serial command. You can leave it set at its default of 57.6 kilobits per second. The output volume has already been covered and is in effect a master volume control that will control the volume of all of the audio files. The audio amp power is not supported on the QThing and can be ignored. And the low power option we have also already covered, and it selects the time after which the QThing will enter into a low power consumption sleep mode. Since there is only a very slight delay when the Q thing reactivates from the sleep mode, I suggest using this function regularly in order to save battery power. The box labelled MIDI is not supported, so you can also ignore this. The trigger test COM port shows the location of the connection between the computer and the fast test cable, if the fast test cable is being used. And again, there is no need to change the setting of the baud rate. And lastly, we have the all-important trigger settings box. This is where most of the programming happens. I recommend experimenting and playing with these various options and functions and the way they can be used together, so that you can get a good idea of the potential creative ways in which the Q thing can be used. The first menu lists all of the 16 triggers or buttons on the Q thing, each of which also corresponds to the switching sockets on the Q thing if you have ordered them. The next menu, labelled Hardware Interface, you do not need to adjust, and it can be left in its default mode of contact closure as it is not supported. The next menu, Type, defines how a Q-Thing button activates a sound file or function. If Edge is selected, then as soon as a Q-Thing button is pressed, the Q-Thing will activate the sound file or function. If Level is selected, then a sound file or function will only be active whilst the Q-Thing button is pressed. If Latch is selected, then the function of the Q-Thing button will be latched on until the function is stopped. So, for example, if trigger 1 is selected, along with the next function and the latch function, then when button 1 of the Q thing is pressed, it will play in sequence all of the selected audio tracks on the Q thing, one after another. If alternatively the Edge function is selected, then each time button 1 is pressed, then only the one track will be played for each button press. The track range specifies the range of tracks that the function applies to. So if 1 to 16 is selected, then all 16 tracks will be played by the next function. But if the track range is set from 1 to 4, then only the first 4 tracks will be played using the next function. The same applies to the previous function. Random will play a random file from the specified track range. Pause will pause all tracks within the specified range, and could also, for example, be level activated, meaning that all the specified tracks are paused whilst the Q thing button is pressed, and will start again only when the button is released. The resume button can be used if tracks are paused via the Edge function, as resume will restart all selected tracks. Stop will stop all of the tracks in the specified track range. Volume up and volume down will adjust the output volume of the cue thing. MIDI bank up and MIDI bank down are not supported. Trigger bank up replaces the currently active 16 audio tracks on the SD card, e.g. tracks 001 to 016, with the next 16 audio tracks on the SD card, i.e. 017 to 032, and maintains all of the existing programming of the cue thing buttons. Trigger bank down reverts back to the previous bank of 16 audio tracks. Invert can be used to invert the action of pressing a button. For example, if level is selected, along with pause, it will mean that all of the tracks within the specified range will be paused when the button is not pressed, i.e. the tracks will be played only whilst the button is pressed. Retriggers means that playback of the same track can be started again whilst a track is still playing, so that two or more playbacks of the same track can happen at the same time. By not selecting retriggers, you can ensure that a track will not play several times simultaneously if its button should be accidentally activated. Polyphonic allows more than one track to be played at the same time. Loop will automatically restart a track from the beginning again when it has finished playing, and it will continue to do so until it is stopped. Lock voice will lock the specified tracks so that they will not be automatically stopped if more than 14 audio tracks are attempted to be activated at the same time. A maximum of 14 tracks can be simultaneously played in polyphonic mode. Trigger volume selects the volume level for each individual audio track or range of tracks. If many tracks are simultaneously activated, the volume of tracks may need to be reduced with this function to prevent sound distortion due to clipping. The reset, add, update, delete, copy and test buttons are used to convert the selected trigger settings into individual init files and write and edit them within the init file contents box. If you wish to use the fast test cable to test an init file after it has been written, then you must select the test button immediately after each init file has been generated in the contents box. If you forget to do so, then you will need to reselect all already written trigger numbers and then select test for each one. You may also write and add comments within the contents box, e.g. adding a date that the files were generated and a description of them and their use. Once you have finished writing all of your init files, you can save the files to a selected location on your computer using the Save As button. I would recommend saving them within a folder and then copying and pasting them to the root directory of your micro SD card.